My name is Claire, and I was 33 years old the day I married into a family that had already decided how I'd quietly vanish from it. The reception was held in a country club ballroom just outside Lexington, Kentucky, all white peonies and old money that, as it turned out, wasn't nearly as old or as real as everyone believed. I was standing behind the bar fixing my veil in a polished brass panel mounted on the wall, a mirror I'd never asked for and almost didn't notice. That accident is the only reason I saw my mother-in-law at all. Eleanor was standing behind me, and she had no idea I could see her reflected in that brass. She wasn't looking at my face. She was looking at my champagne. I watched her pull a small glass vial from her clutch and tip 3 clear drops into my flute. I didn't turn around. I didn't gasp. I'd spent 8 years working in an emergency room. And in that job you learn fast how to keep your expression steady while your hands do exactly what needs to be done. I swapped our glasses while she smiled out at the room. What happened after she lifted that flute to her lips is the part nobody in that ballroom was prepared for. Welcome to her side of the story, for every woman who held it together alone. If you've ever been the one seated at the far table and quietly expected to stay small, this one's for you. Stick around, and if you want more stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Let me rewind about 3 years, because you should understand who I was long before that ballroom. I was raised on a horse and cattle farm in the Kentucky Hill Country, the kind of place where the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke before sunrise. My dad worked the fences and the herd mostly alone, because hired help cost money we didn't have. When I was 19, the bank sent a letter that nearly took the whole property. I remember my mother reading it twice at the kitchen table, folding it into a small square, and saying, "We'll manage." And we did. I took on 2 jobs and worked my way through nursing school at night, sending every extra dollar home until that note was paid off. Nobody ever handed me a thing. I learned to read people the same way my father read, whether by the small signs, the tightness around someone's eyes, the way a hand goes still right before bad news lands. In the ER, that instinct keeps people alive. You watch the patients who insist they're fine. You watch the quiet ones, hardest of all. By 30, I was a charge nurse, steady under pressure, the person colleagues called when a room started falling apart. What I was never good at was letting anyone else carry weight for me. I fixed things. I handled things. I stood between other people and the worst day of their lives. And somewhere along the way I convinced myself that was the same thing as real closeness. It isn't that habit would cost me later, in ways I never expected, but it would also be exactly what saved me. Reading a room is a survival skill, and mine was about to be tested by the most composed, most dangerous person I would ever meet. I met Ryan at the hospital, of all places. He'd brought his uncle in for chest pains and sat in that waiting room for 9 straight hours, without once asking a nurse to hurry things along. That patience is what caught my attention first. We dated quietly for almost a year before he introduced me to his mother. The Whitfield family home sat on close to 40 acres outside town, white columns, a long gravel drive, an oil portrait of some ancestor nobody could quite place. Eleanor greeted us in the front parlor with a smile that arrived half a beat too late. She asked about my parents, and when I said we ran a farm, she repeated the word like she was holding something unpleasant with tongs. "And what exactly do your people do?" she asked, as though livestock were some sort of charming hobby. I explained. She turned to Ryan and said, "How rustic." Over dinner she mentioned the Whitfield name at least 4 times and the family trust twice. When I stood to help clear plates, she touched my wrist and delivered the line I'd hear echoing in my sleep for years to come. "You can dress a nurse up in white," she said. Smiling, but she's still staff. The table laughed like it was a joke. Ryan didn't. He caught my eye across the table and reached for my hand under it. That was the moment I understood 2 things at once. His mother saw me as hired help who had wandered into the family photograph, and the fortune she guarded so fiercely wasn't nearly as solid as that house wanted people to believe. I just didn't yet know how far she'd go to protect both of those secrets. 3 years is a long time to be corrected politely, and that was Eleanor's method. Never a slap, always a small tap. At Thanksgiving, she seated me at the kids' table and called it cozy. At Christmas, she handed everyone a wrapped gift and slid me a gift card because she wasn't sure of my taste. Whenever the family lined up for portraits on the staircase, somehow, I was always the one holding the dog. I have almost no photos of myself from 2 entire holiday seasons. I stopped bringing it up because bringing it up made me the problem. Meanwhile, I started noticing the shape of what she was actually protecting. The Whitfield estate ran through a family trust, and Ryan's share of it quietly covered more of our life than he liked to admit: the car, part of our place in the city, the club membership. Eleanor controlled the money. Gerald Hastings, the family's longtime attorney, controlled the paperwork. Ryan had grown up believing the trust was practically his father's legacy, made physical, and that loyalty to it was loyalty to his father's memory. He wasn't greedy, he was dependent, which is a much quieter kind of trap. I kept circling one question that wouldn't leave me alone. Why would a woman with that much status spend so much energy trying to shrink a farm girl down to nothing? Contempt is cheap. Effort costs something. And Eleanor was spending real effort making me feel small. People don't do that out of simple snobbery. They do it out of fear. I should have followed that thread sooner. By the time I did, I was already engaged. And the wedding was already being run by the one person in that family who genuinely unsettled me. Ryan proposed on the back porch of my parents' farm, with the old barn behind him, and he did it there on purpose. I loved him for that. I fully expected Eleanor to fight the wedding. She didn't, and that should have been my first real warning. Within a week, she'd appointed herself the planner, to take the burden off you. Dear, you work such long shifts. She booked the venue. She chose the flowers, the cake, the seating chart. When I tried once to push back on the guest list, she squeezed my hand and said, "Let me give you this. It's the least this family can do." It was so warm it made my skin crawl, and I couldn't have told you exactly why. The one thing she insisted on, said 3 separate times, was the toast. "I'll pour the champagne myself," she told me, "and say a few words before we all raise our glasses. A mother should get to bless her son's marriage." Ryan thought it was sweet. I thought it was strange that a woman who had never once blessed anything I'd done suddenly wanted to bless the most important day of my life. But I was exhausted from working for 12-hour shifts a week, and I let it go. That's the part I keep coming back to. I noticed the wrongness. I felt the cold current running under all that warmth. And I told myself I was being unfair to a woman finally trying to be kind. I let her pour the champagne. I let her run the toast. I walked into my own wedding having already handed a dangerous woman the exact tool she'd been asking for. The rehearsal dinner was the night before, in a private room at the club. Eleanor had place cards written in calligraphy and a toast she pretended was spontaneous. She'd been unnervingly warm all evening, refilling glasses, laughing at my father's jokes about cattle. Near the end, she stood and tapped a spoon against her glass, and the room hushed for her the way rooms always did. She talked about Ryan as a little boy. She talked about legacy, about the Whitfield name, about family being more than blood, about loyalty. Then she lifted her glass, looked directly at me, and said, "To family. The real kind." Everyone drank and beamed. My mother squeezed my arm. But I watched Eleanor's face over the rim of her glass, and her eyes never warmed the way her mouth did. There's a specific look a patient gets when they're smiling and lying at the same time. A flatness in the cheeks, a stillness in the eyes that doesn't match the curve of the lips. Nurses learn to spot it on the worst nights. Eleanor had that exact look. Ryan leaned over and whispered, "See? She's coming around." I nodded, because I wanted so badly for that to be true. I wanted, just once, to be wrong about someone. I told myself the toast was just her being dramatic. I let it slide right off me. I would hear those same 4 words again the very next day, in the same voice, with the same flat eyes, and the second time they would land like a verdict. I didn't know yet that she'd meant them as a sentence, and that she'd already decided exactly how she planned to carry it out. The wedding day was bright and a little too warm, the kind of June afternoon that makes everyone drink faster than they mean to. The ceremony went off without a single hitch. Ryan even teared up during his vows, something I'll never admit to him that I noticed. The reception spilled into the ballroom, and the staff lined the marble bar with champagne flutes for the toast. Eleanor had insisted on running herself. I slipped behind the corner of that bar to fix my veil, which had come loose during our first dance. Months earlier, I'd admired that brass panel behind the bar and mentioned it to the event coordinator, so I knew it was there. I was staring at my own reflection, pinning the veil back into place, when a second figure rose into the brass behind me. Eleanor. She was standing at the bar maybe 3 feet away, completely unaware I could see her. She set down 2 flutes, mine marked with a thin gold ribbon she'd tied around the stem herself, so the bride doesn't lose hers. Then she opened her clutch. I watched her fingers find a small glass vial, the kind that comes from a pharmacy, watched her thumb the dropper, and watched her tip 3 clear drops into the ribboned flute. My flute. She capped the vial, tucked it away, and adjusted a nearby rose, as if nothing at all had happened. I had maybe 5 seconds before she'd turn and go looking for me. Every alarm bell I owned went off at once. The same calm, red alarm that fires when a patient codes and the room needs exactly one person not to panic. I didn't let my face move. I'd learned after 1,000 bad moments that whoever moves first with steady hands controls what happens next. So I made my hands steady. I finished pinning the veil. I smiled at my own reflection and decided, in that long quiet second, precisely what I was going to do. I turned around as if I'd just noticed her. "There you are," I said, as warmly as I could manage. "Is it almost time?" Her smile snapped back into place. "Almost, dear," she said. "Go find Ryan. I'll bring the glasses." She started to steer me toward the floor, and I touched her arm. "Oh, I'm parched. Let me carry them." Before she could refuse, I'd already picked up both flutes, one in each hand, holding them out like an offering. "You take the toast. I'll be your bartender for 10 seconds. She had no graceful way to say no in front of the bartender and 2 passing relatives. I handed her a glass and kept the other for myself, and in that half-second exchange, with my body blocking her view of the bar, I gave her the flute with the gold ribbon. Her own 3 drops, now resting in her own hand. I kept the plain one. She never noticed. People see what they expect to see, and she expected the marked glass to be in the bride's hand, exactly where she'd left it. We walked out to the center of the dance floor together, the dangerous woman and me, both smiling for the cameras. Ryan found me glowing, completely unaware. Eleanor tapped her glass with a ring, and 200 guests fell silent for her, the way they always did. She raised the ribboned flute, found my eyes, and said it again, in that same grand voice with the same flat stare. "To family. The real kind." And then, while 200 people lifted their glasses in my honor, my brand new mother-in-law took a long swallow of her own champagne. I touched mine to my lips and didn't drink. I set it down behind a centerpiece, then quietly slipped the ribboned flute into the small beaded clutch on my wrist, and waited. That's when things really started. It took about 40 minutes. We were partway through dinner when Eleanor's words began to slur at the edges. She laughed a beat too long at something a guest said. She reached for her water glass and missed it by an inch, then laughed at that too. By the time the band started up, she was listing sideways in her chair like a sail with no wind left in it. Jessica, her daughter, went pale and rushed over. Gerald appeared at her elbow with a frown that didn't match the moment, the worry of a man watching his own plan collapse, not the worry of a confused bystander. Eleanor tried to stand, and her knees simply gave out. It took 2 cousins and a waiter to walk her out to a waiting car. The matriarch of the Whitfield family, glassy-eyed and mumbling, hanging between 2 men in front of every single guest she'd ever wanted to impress. The whispers started before the doors even shut. Someone said she must have overdone the wine out of nerves. Someone else said they'd never once seen her like that in 40 years. I stood there in my wedding dress and watched the woman who had engineered my public collapse get folded into the back of a car by people she'd spent her whole life ranking beneath herself. I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt cold, a clean, clinical kind of cold, because a nurse knows the difference between 3 glasses of wine and a chemical. And I was watching that difference walk right out the door, with her flute still sitting in the clutch on my wrist. The party carried on. Ryan danced with me and worried out loud about his mother. I held him and said nothing, because I didn't have the one thing yet that would let me say anything at all: proof. I stood there in my veil, watching guests murmur behind cupped hands, and I made a decision I want you to remember. I wasn't going to scream, or accuse, or blow up my own wedding over a feeling. I was going to do exactly what 8 years in an emergency room had trained me to do: stay calm, secure the evidence, and let the facts do the talking I never could. We spent our wedding night at a hotel near the venue, and I lay awake while Ryan slept beside me. The doubts crept in around 3 in the morning, the way they always do. Maybe I'd imagined the vial. Maybe it was eye drops, or heart medication, or something perfectly innocent, and my exhausted brain had turned it sinister. I'd been awake for 20 hours. I'd been quietly resented by this woman for 3 years. Wasn't it possible I'd finally cracked and seen a monster where there was really just a bitter old woman? I nearly talked myself out of the whole thing. Then, I got up, carried the beaded clutch into the bathroom, and looked at the flute inside under the light, the gold ribbon, the faint film clinging to the bottom that wine alone never leaves behind. I'm a nurse. I've handled thousands of samples. My hands knew what to do before my brain finished arguing with itself. I found a clean laundry bag from the hotel closet, slid the flute in without touching the rim, knotted it, and labeled it in pen with the date, the time, and where it came from, the same way I'd label a blood draw I might have to swear to in court. Then I sat on the cold tile in my wedding nightgown and made myself say the truth out loud, once, so I'd stop being afraid of it. If I was wrong, I'd quietly throw it away and never mention it to a living soul, and I'd have lost nothing but a little sleep. If I was right, the woman who had just legally become my mother had tried to drug me at my own wedding to make me look like a falling down drunk in front of everyone who mattered to her son. There was only one way to find out which one it was, and I wasn't going to ask the family. I was going to ask a lab. Monday morning I went back to work, smiled at everyone, and stayed late. A forensic tech named Michelle had trained alongside me for 6 years, and we'd carried each other through 3 brutal codes in a single overnight shift once. That kind of night builds a different sort of trust between people. I caught her on a breakaway from the floor and told her the truth, plainly, because I don't lie to people I respect. I never asked her to test anything herself. The hospital's own lab was the last place on earth a sample like this belonged. I asked her exactly one thing: how does a nurse preserve something so that a court will actually trust it later? Michelle didn't flinch. She told me to keep it sealed, touch nothing further, and call a lawyer before doing anything else. She pointed me toward an independent forensic toxicology lab that regularly handled chain of custody work for defense and family attorneys. Pay for it yourself, through their private channel, she said. Fill out their custody form. Ship it yourself. Don't let anyone in this building near it. If it's nothing, you'll feel a little silly for a week. If it's something, you'll be glad you didn't hand it to a cop in a sandwich bag. I packaged the flute exactly the way she described, filled out the chain of custody form, and shipped it overnight to an independent lab a few hours away. Then came the part I've always been worst at, waiting for 9 days. I went to work. Came home to our apartment, kissed my new husband, and said absolutely nothing about the package that could tear his family apart. I told myself I was protecting him until I was certain. The truth was, I was doing what I always do, carrying the heaviest thing completely alone. Because I never learned how to set it down on the table between 2 people. That habit was about to start tearing at the one good thing in my life. On the 5th day I tried to say something. Ryan had spent 2 evenings genuinely worried about his mother, who'd gone home and taken to her bed with what Gerald was calling exhaustion. Ryan sat at our kitchen counter one night, turning his coffee mug in slow circles, and said, "I just don't get it. She's never had more than 2 drinks in her life." It was the opening I'd been waiting for. I set down my own mug and said, carefully, "Ryan, I don't think it was the wine." He looked up. "What do you mean?" I told him everything I'd seen in that brass panel: the vial, the 3 drops, the gold ribbon, the switch. I kept my voice level, the same voice I used to tell a family their father isn't going to make it. He listened to all of it. Then his expression closed like a door. "You think my mother poisoned you?" he said. Not a question, an accusation, aimed straight back at me. I think she drugged the glass meant for me, I said, and drank it herself by mistake. He stood so fast his stool scraped the floor. She had too much to drink, Claire. That's all this is. I'd expected denial. I hadn't expected it to feel like being slapped. I almost told him about the lab right then. I almost laid the whole thing out on the counter. But the look on his face told me he'd defend her against a feeling with everything he had. And all I had, in that moment, was a feeling, not yet a number on a page. So I did what I always do. I closed the door he'd just closed, and I carried it alone a little longer, waiting for the lab results. That weekend, the family threw a post-wedding brunch at the Whitfield house. Since Eleanor, feeling so much better, wanted to thank everyone for their patience, I almost skipped it. I went because staying away would have looked exactly like the guilt they were hoping to pin on me. The house was full of relatives eating quiche off the good china. Eleanor held court from an armchair, with a blanket over her knees, playing the fragile, recovering matriarch, thanking the room for understanding her little spell. She didn't look at me once. I drifted toward a quiet hallway, and that's where I saw them. Jessica and Gerald tucked into the study off the hall, talking low and fast. Jessica had her arms crossed tight. Gerald held a thick manila folder against his chest like a shield. I caught only the tail end of it before they noticed me. Can't wait. The timing matters now. Jessica spotted me in the doorway, and the conversation died instantly. Claire, she said, too brightly. Just some boring trust paperwork. She steered Gerald past me, folder and all. I caught a glimpse of a printed cover sheet with a date typed across the top. I didn't catch the date itself, but I caught the feeling. The same cold feeling from the wedding. Jessica drowning in something. Gerald guarding paper like his life depended on it. Eleanor performing fragility for an audience. 3 people, 1 folder, and a sentence that ended with the timing matters now. I went back to the brunch and ate quiche I couldn't taste, adding it all to the growing list in my head. Whatever Eleanor had tried to do to me, she clearly hadn't been working alone, and they weren't finished yet. The lab report arrived on a Tuesday, 9 days after the wedding, while I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage, on a 15-minute break. It came through as a secure PDF. I remember staring at the concrete pillar in front of my windshield, the number painted on it in faded yellow, because I stared at that number for a long time after reading the results. The report named 1 compound present, at a concentration flagged in bold. A benzodiazepine, not eye drops, not heart medication. A powerful sedative, the kind that can drop a grown adult into a slurring knee-buckling fog within the hour. The kind that, in a woman my size, after 2 glasses of champagne, could easily have put me flat on that ballroom floor in front of 200 people. The estimated dose wasn't small. It wasn't anything anyone takes by accident, and it certainly wasn't anything that belonged anywhere near a glass of champagne. I read it 3 times. The first time I felt nothing, that clinical blankness that lets you keep functioning. The second time, my hands started shaking against the steering wheel. The third time, I finally understood, completely, both what had almost happened to me, and what had actually been intended to happen. She hadn't wanted me dead. That was almost worse. She'd wanted me ruined, wanted Ryan's new wife to crumple and slur and humiliate herself in front of every Whitfield who mattered, so that for the rest of my life I'd be remembered as the bride who fell apart, the unstable nurse who couldn't hold her liquor, the mistake the family quietly corrected before it was too late. That number on the page was the proof I'd been waiting 9 days for. Now I had the what. What I needed next was the why, and a way to prove she'd meant every second of it. The why arrived 2 days later, delivered by Ryan's own hands. He'd gone to check on his mother and came home carrying a thick envelope. "Mom wanted us to look these over," he said, dropping it on the counter. "Some trust thing Gerald says we both need to sign." He went to shower, and I sat alone with that envelope, and after a while I opened it. Because by then, I'd stopped pretending we were the kind of family where you don't read the fine print. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a postnuptial agreement, drafted by Gerald. That would have stripped me of any claim whatsoever to Whitfield money or property in the event of divorce, or, as the document specifically phrased it, in the event of incapacity or conduct rendering the marriage voidable. The second was worse. A draft annulment petition, alleging that I had entered the marriage under false pretenses and displayed erratic and intoxicated behavior, suggesting I was unfit. Both documents were dated. I checked the dates twice, then a third time, because I needed to be sure my eyes weren't showing me what I wanted to see. The postnup was dated 11 days before the wedding. The annulment petition was dated 9 days before the wedding. They had drafted the paperwork to dissolve my marriage before I had even walked down the aisle. The drugging wasn't an impulsive act. It was the trigger for a plan that had already been sitting in a folder, waiting for me to collapse on cue so it could be filed. I heard the shower shut off down the hall, and I understood that the man, drying his hair 20 feet away, had just carried proof of his own mother's scheme into our home, in his own hands. I didn't ambush him. I made coffee. When he came out, I asked him to sit, and I laid 3 things on the counter in a row, like instruments on a tray: the toxicology report, the postnup, the annulment petition. "Read the dates," I said. "That's all I'm asking," he read. I watched it land the way I've watched it land on 100 families in a hospital hallway. The slow arrival of a truth too large to absorb in one breath. His face moved from annoyed, to confused, to something gray and stricken. "These are dated before the wedding," he said quietly. "Both of them." "Yes. And this," I said, touching the report without picking it up, like it was hot to the touch, "is what was in the glass." "The glass meant for me," I said, "which your mother drank instead." "Because I switched them." He put both hands flat on the counter and stared at nothing for a long time. "She told me you'd been unstable," he finally said. "Last week, she said the marriage had brought out something in you. She asked me to keep an eye on your drinking." His voice cracked on the last word, because he finally understood the script had been written for him too. He'd been cast as the loving, reluctant son who'd quietly agree his new wife wasn't well. "Ryan," I said, "I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to look at the dates and tell me what you see." He looked up, eyes wet and furious, and for the first time, that fury wasn't pointed at me. "I see," he said, "that my mother planned all of this before we were even married." Eleanor didn't sit quietly while the two of us figured things out. A drowning person grabs whatever's closest, and what was closest to her was the family's faith in her. Within the week, the calls started. An aunt phoned Ryan to say she'd heard his new wife had been acting strangely and drinking heavily. Was he all right? A cousin texted me directly to say she was here if I ever needed help with anything. In that careful tone people reserve for the addict in the family. Eleanor had spent 3 years quietly establishing that I was beneath the family. Now she spent 2 weeks establishing that I was unstable, working the phone tree from her armchair, planting the same seed in a dozen ears, building the very audience that would later nod along once the annulment was filed. And here's the genius of it: cold as it was, the more upset I got, the more it proved her point. If I called relatives to defend myself, I was the hysterical bride. If I stayed silent, the story simply filled in the silence on its own. It was a trap with no clean exit, designed by someone who understood that reputation is a courtroom where the accused never actually gets to speak. For about a day, it got to me. I drafted furious texts I never sent. I rehearsed speeches in the shower. Then I made myself stop, sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad, and did the thing my father taught me the day that bank letter arrived. Stop reacting to the storm and start taking inventory of what I actually had. Because I'd realized something important. Eleanor was fighting the war she knew how to win, and I was about to make her fight one she didn't. Here's what I understood at that kitchen table, and what I want you to understand too. Eleanor's weapons were rumor, charm, and a chemical in a glass. Things that thrive in the dark and collapse the instant a light gets turned on. My instinct, the wounded part of me, wanted to fight her on her own terms. Call relatives. Whisper my own version. Win the gossip war. That instinct was the trap. You cannot out-rumor a woman who's spent 40 years building her reputation. So I chose different weapons, on purpose. The ones I actually had. Documents, a chain of custody, witnesses, the law. I'm a nurse, not a fighter. My entire career is built on documenting things so clearly, that nobody can argue with them later. On preserving the truth so a doctor coming on shift 3 hours from now can trust it completely. That was the war I actually knew how to fight. The next morning I did 2 things. I called a lawyer, a quiet, sharp woman named Karen Ellison, who'd handled a malpractice case I'd witnessed years earlier and never forgotten. And I called the non-emergency line at the county sheriff's office and asked how someone reports a poisoning when she has the toxicology results and the container. They told me to come in. That night I told Ryan both things, no more hiding it. The report, the lawyer, the sheriff, all of it laid out on the table between us. I'm not going to scream at your family, I said. I'm going to do this in daylight, with paper, the right way. I just need to know if you're standing next to me or across from me when I do it. He didn't hesitate. Next to you, he said, and he meant it. Karen Ellison was the kind of lawyer who listens for an hour before she says 10 words. I laid everything out on her conference table and she made me walk through it twice while she took precise, tiny notes. Then she told me what I had and what I didn't. What I had was strong, a sealed flute with a documented chain of custody, a forensic report naming a sedative at a meaningful dose, and a postnup and annulment petition dated before the wedding, which spoke directly to intent. The hardest thing to prove in a case like this. What I didn't have yet, she said, was the human glue, the people who could put Eleanor's hand on that vial in the eyes of a jury or a family. So we built it. The event coordinator remembered Eleanor at the bar before the toast, fussing with the flutes herself. A bartender remembered the gold ribbon, and remembered me carrying both glasses away. A cousin, the same one who'd offered me help, sheepishly admitted that Eleanor had called her a full week before the wedding to warn that I had a drinking problem we'd all have to manage. Which, given that I barely drink and the wedding hadn't even happened yet, was a lie with a timestamp on it. Karen lined these up like sutures, one after another, each one closing the wound a little tighter. Proving she meant to do this is the whole game, she told me. Anyone can spike a glass. Spiking a glass with the divorce papers already drafted, that's a plan. Plans have authors. She set down her pen, and your mother-in-law left her fingerprints all over the paperwork. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. The deeper Karen dug into the trust, the more the entire picture shifted. Eleanor hadn't been the only one with a reason to want me gone, and she might not even have been the one who dreamed it up. Jessica, it turned out, was deep underwater financially. Her event planning business had folded 18 months earlier, leaving her personally on the hook for nearly $400,000 in loans she couldn't service. She'd been quietly pressuring her mother for an early distribution from the trust. And the trust itself, Karen discovered, was nowhere near as full as the family believed. That was Gerald's piece of it, serving as both trustee and the trust's attorney. An arrangement built for exactly the kind of self-dealing nobody had ever thought to check. He'd spent years billing the trust generously and moving assets through entities only he could fully see. The estate that funded the columns and the club memberships and Ryan's allowance was a shell propped up entirely by appearances. A daughter-in-law who'd lawyered up, who started asking for an accounting, who gained marital property rights the day the marriage held, and could ask a court to divide the estate fairly if it ever fell apart. That daughter-in-law was a threat to all 3 of them at once. Eleanor feared losing the family name. Jessica needed the trust drained before anyone looked too closely. Gerald needed nobody to ever audit his work. I had married into a house, rotting quietly behind its own paint, and my arrival had started a clock they could only stop by making me disappear cleanly, on paper, before I noticed the rot underneath. Suddenly, the drugging made a horrible kind of sense. Make the bride collapse. File the pre-drafted annulment. Void the marriage, and my rights along with it. Keep the rot hidden for 1 more year. 3 people, 3 motives, 1 folder. I'd thought I was fighting a snob. I was actually fighting a scheme, and schemes, unlike snobs, leave records. I want to pause here for a second, because this is where I had to make a real choice. I could have leaked all of it. The debt, the hollowed out trust, the lie about my drinking, and burned the whole family down in a week of phone calls. I didn't. I handed it to my lawyer in the sheriff's office instead, and let daylight do the work. There was one evening, before any of it broke into the open, when I almost felt sorry for her. Ryan had gone to the house to tell his mother that he knew not the whole scheme yet, just that he'd seen the dates and wasn't signing anything. I waited in the car. He came back an hour later and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, and told me what she'd said. She hadn't denied any of it. She'd done something worse, she'd explained it. She told him about his father's first marriage, the one before her, the wife who'd charmed the old man and then, over a decade, quietly bled the family estate down to a fraction of what it had been. Lawyer by lawyer, account by account, smiling the entire time. Eleanor had watched it happen as a young woman engaged to marry into that same family. She'd watched those columns go up on a house that was already hollow underneath. She swore, she told him, that she'd never let it happen again. She said the second she met you, Ryan told me, staring through the windshield. A nurse, no money, marrying up, she knew. She said she finally did what nobody in that first situation ever had the spine to do. I sat with that for a while. I won't pretend it didn't move something in me. She wasn't a cartoon villain. She was a frightened older woman who'd built her entire identity around guarding a legacy that no longer existed. Who'd looked at me and seen a ghost from 40 years earlier. And who'd decided that fear gave her the right to drug a stranger at a party. Understanding her wasn't the same thing as forgiving her. A reason explains a great deal. It excuses nothing. Ryan made his choice through actions, not speeches, which is exactly how I knew it was real. The very next morning, he called the bank and began untangling his life from his mother's trust. It was harder than it should have been, because his accounts were tangled up with the family's in ways Gerald had clearly designed to be difficult to unwind. But he started anyway. He moved his direct deposit. He opened an account in just our two names. He resigned, in writing, from a small advisory role on the trust that Gerald had handed him years earlier, specifically to keep him inside the tent. Every step cost him something. He'd grown up believing the trust was practically his father, in some sense that protecting it was the one thing his father had ever asked of him. Letting go of it felt, to him, like walking away from a grave. He did it anyway. One night he told me, "I keep waiting to feel like I'm betraying her. And instead I just feel like I finally stopped letting her betray you." Then he told me he wanted to be in the room for whatever came next. Karen and the sheriff's investigator had been quietly building toward sit down, a formal meeting. The family didn't yet understand the real shape of Gerald and Eleanor were arranging their own meeting, calling it a trust review, where they planned to confront me, present their unstable bride narrative, and produce the annulment papers for Ryan to formally consider. They believed they were summoning me to my own quiet execution. We let them believe that. Ryan asked for one thing only. "Whatever you bring into that room," he said, "let me be standing next to you when you set it down." The meeting was set for a Sunday afternoon at the Whitfield house. In the formal front parlor under that old family portrait, around a long mahogany table, Gerald called it a family trust review. The invitation, relayed through Ryan, made the real agenda clear without ever saying it outright. They wanted both of us there. They wanted Eleanor, recovered now, to speak about her concerns for the family's well-being. They wanted Gerald present to walk everyone through some documents. It was the staging of an intervention, with me cast as the patient and the annulment as the cure. I knew exactly what folder would be sitting on that table. So Karen and I prepared a different one. We had the sealed flute photographed and logged. We had the forensic report. We had the postnup and the annulment petition, with their impossible dates. We had short, signed statements from the event coordinator, the bartender, and the cousin. And we had one more guest the family had no idea was coming. I spent that entire week strangely calm. The flat, steady calm I get right before a shift I already know is going to be brutal. I laid my clothes out the night before. I read the report one final time, not because I needed to, but the way you check your kit before a code. Ryan asked if I was nervous. I told him the truth. I've stood at the foot of a lot of hospital beds and told a lot of families the thing they didn't want to hear, I said. I know how to keep my voice steady while the room falls apart around it. He took my hand across the table. The trap they'd built had exactly one flaw they'd never considered. They'd assumed the quiet one in the family was the one who'd eventually break. They were about to discover she was actually the one. who'd been writing everything down. We arrived at the Whitfield house at 2 on Sunday, and the front room was arranged like a stage. Eleanor sat at the head of the mahogany table, fully restored to herself, pearls on the cup of tea she never touched in front of her. Gerald sat at her right, his manila folder squared neatly in front of him. Jessica sat at her left, pale fingers worrying the hem of her sleeve. A handful of others had been invited to the aunt who'd made the worried phone call, another cousin, and the old family minister who'd officiated our wedding and whom Second Eleanor had brought along to lend the afternoon a bit of holy weight. Ryan and I were shown two chairs at the foot of the table, the petitioner's end, the children's end. I noticed the seating arrangement and nearly smiled. Some habits never really die. I set my own folder down in front of me, plain and unremarkable, and folded my hands over it. 2 other people had come with us that day, and the room had no idea they were waiting quietly in the front hall. One was Karen Ellison, my attorney. The other was investigator Diane Coleman, from the county sheriff's office, who had spent 3 weeks quietly confirming everything in my folder and had asked, with great interest, to be present when the Whitfield family reviewed their documents. I hadn't told the room they were there. I wanted Eleanor to begin. I wanted her to lay her plan out on the table with her own 2 hands, in front of the very minister she'd brought to bless it, before she learned that the daughter-in-law she'd tried to erase had quietly brought the law into her own front room. Eleanor cleared her throat, and the room went silent for her, the way it always did. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "We need to talk about Claire. She was good, I'll give her that much, right to the very end." She spoke softly, more in sorrow than anger, the wounded matriarch forced to address a painful family matter. She talked about how worried she'd been since the wedding. She reminded everyone of her spell that day, letting the implications settle over the room, that something about the bride, about the strain the bride had brought into the family, had upset the whole event. She said she'd noticed changes in me, moods, concerns about drinking she'd hoped were nothing. The aunt nodded along, primed by 3 weeks of careful phone calls. Then Eleanor turned to Gerald. "Gerald's looked into some protections for the family," she said. "For Ryan's sake, we think it's only prudent." Gerald opened his folder with a lawyer's practiced gravity and slid 2 documents into the center of the table. The annulment petition. "These are difficult things to discuss," he said smoothly, "but given the circumstances, the family feels Ryan should consider whether this marriage was entered into in good faith. There's no shame in correcting a mistake early." He looked at Ryan with rehearsed sympathy. "Son, no one is forcing anything. We just want you to have options." It was beautifully done. The trap sprung gently, with tea and a minister and a folder full of options. They waited for me to cry, or shout, or beg to perform exactly the instability they'd spent weeks advertising. I did none of it. I sat at the foot of that table with my hands folded over my own plain folder, and I let the silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable for everyone in the room but me. Then I looked at Gerald, and at Eleanor, and said the one thing the room wasn't ready to hear. "Before anyone signs anything," I said, "I think you should know what was in the glass." I opened my folder and began, quietly, 1 item at a time, the way I'd give a report at the end of a shift. "On the night of the wedding," I said, "Eleanor stood at the bar and tied a gold ribbon around one of 2 flutes. The bartender remembers. The event coordinator remembers." I slid their signed statements to the center of the table, beside Gerald's documents. Then she added 3 drops from a glass vial into the ribboned flute. I saw her do it, reflected in the brass panel behind the bar. I set down a photograph of the sealed flute in its evidence bag. Gold ribbon visible, the date and time in my own handwriting on the label. I didn't drink from that glass. I switched ours, and she drank it herself, which is why she couldn't stand at her own son's reception. I placed the forensic report on the table and turned it so Eleanor could read the bold line at the top. This is what was inside it. "A sedative, at a dose meant to put a woman my size flat on the floor, not to kill me. To humiliate me. To make me look exactly the way you've spent 3 weeks telling everyone I already am." The aunt's hand rose slowly to her mouth. The minister went very still. I reached for the last 2 pages. "And these," I said, touching the postnup and the annulment petition Gerald had just laid down so proudly, are dated. This one, 11 days before the wedding. This one, 9 days before. You drafted the paperwork to end my marriage before I was even married. The drug was just the cue to file it. Eleanor opened her mouth and I raised one hand gently, the way you calm a frightened patient. I'm almost finished, I said. Jessica owes nearly $400,000 she can't pay. The trust everyone in this room believes is full has been managed for years by a man who is both its trustee and its attorney, and who has never once let anyone audit his own work. A daughter-in-law with rights was a problem for all three of you, at exactly the same time, so you tried to drug her out of the family. I looked around the silent table and left them with the line I'd been saving, the one that held the entire afternoon together. Don't drink what someone else pours you, I said quietly. You'll always want to know what's in it first. Eleanor broke first, and she broke loudly. How dare you, she said, rising out of her chair, her voice climbing in a way I don't think this family had ever heard from her. How dare you bring this filth into my home? Into your father's house? She wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to the room, to the aunt, to the minister trying to wrench the audience back onto her side. She switched the glasses. She's admitting it. She drugged me. Karen chose that exact moment to step in from the hallway. She switched to glasses your client had already tampered with, Karen said calmly. Drinking your own poison isn't a crime committed against you. Behind her came Investigator Coleman, in a plain jacket, badge clipped to her belt, and the temperature in the room changed instantly. Jessica made a small strangled sound and turned on her own mother. I told you this was insane. I told you the paperwork was too much. I never agreed to, she stopped herself, but it was already too late. The agreement was hanging in the air now, for everyone to hear. Gerald was already gathering his documents with shaking hands, insisting he'd need to consult his own counsel, that he'd only ever been acting on information provided by his client, that he couldn't be held responsible. All three of them turned on each other inside of a single minute, each one reaching for the lifeboat, each one shoving the others off it. Eleanor stood at the head of the table. She'd ruled for 40 years and watched her allies scatter, and her face finally did the thing I'd seen at the rehearsal dinner. The smile gone, the flatness underneath it exposed for exactly what it had always been, that through all of it. I stayed in my chair at the foot of the table, hands folded, saying nothing, because there was nothing left for me to add. The paperwork had already said it for me. In the middle of all that noise, Ryan stood up. He didn't shout. He walked the full length of the table, past his mother, past Gerald and his trembling folder, past his sister, and stopped beside my chair, resting his hand on my shoulder where the entire room could see it. I've heard enough, he said. His voice stayed quiet, but it carried, because everyone had gone silent to see which way this was going to fall. You drafted papers to throw my wife out before I even married her, he said to his mother. You put a drug in her glass at our wedding. And you brought a minister here today to help you finish the job cleanly. Eleanor reached for him, the old reach, the one that had always worked before. Ryan, everything I did to protect this family. You're not the family, he said. She is. Then he looked at her for one long moment, and handed her back the exact words she'd used against me twice. Once at the rehearsal, once over my poisoned glass, and in his mouth, they finally meant something true. The real kind, he said. Then he helped me up from the petitioner's chair at the foot of the table, and we walked out of that front room together. Past Investigator Coleman, who gave me a small nod, past the old family portrait, and out into the bright June afternoon. Behind us, that house full of old money that wasn't there anymore had finally, completely, gone quiet. I'll tell you what happened to each of them afterward, because I know you'll want to know, and because the daylight I chose did exactly what daylight always does. Investigator Coleman took my folder, the flute, and the report, and built a formal case. These things move slower than television ever promises. It was nearly 4 months before a grand jury heard it. Proving intent had been the entire question, and the documents dated before the wedding answered it completely. That fall, Eleanor was charged with a felony, the kind that carries real prison time. Because spiking a drink with a sedative isn't a prank, and the law doesn't treat it like one. especially when divorce papers are already sitting in a drawer with dates that don't lie. She was arraigned in the same county where she'd hosted 40 years of charity gala. She didn't go to jail that day. The system moves slowly, but the case keeps moving. And even her own lawyer has told her, there's no version of this where the dates simply disappear. Gerald's part unraveled on its own separate track. The moment Karen filed for a full accounting that summer, the rot came up through the floorboards, and it kept surfacing for the better part of a year. The state bar opened an inquiry into a man who'd served as both trustee and counsel, while quietly billing an estate into a shell of itself. The trust was frozen, pending an independent audit, and the early numbers suggested years of self-dealing that had nothing whatsoever to do with me. By the following spring, Jessica's debt had become the least of her problems, because her name kept surfacing throughout the timeline of the plan. She's cooperating now, which is really just a polite way of saying she's telling the truth about her mother in exchange for not being charged alongside her. The Whitfield estate, the columns, the club membership, the legacy Eleanor had been willing to drug a stranger to protect, turned out to have been hollow for years. She'd spent her whole life guarding a ghost. As for Ryan and me, we did the one thing that mattered most, and it wasn't dramatic at all. We drew a line, and we held it. No contact. Everything through Karen. We took nothing that was theirs, and sold nothing that was theirs, and asked for nothing except to be left alone, which after everything, felt like the richest thing we owned. He finished untangling his finances from the trust, and we started over on a nurse's salary, smaller and cleaner and entirely ours. I went back to my unit, back to the 4-A.M, coffee and the families living through the worst hour of their lives. And I was somehow better at all of it for having sat calmly at the foot of that mahogany table. People sometimes ask if I wish I'd just thrown that flute away that night and never found out the truth. I don't, because the truth, once I actually had it on paper, didn't make me bitter. It made me free. I stopped being a guest in a family that wanted me gone. And I became a woman who finally knew exactly where she stood. If there's one thing I learned at the foot of that table, it's this. The people who decide you don't belong are almost always the ones most afraid of what they'd lose if you did. And staying calm isn't weakness. It's the steadiest hand in the room. That's my story. 1 glass, 3 drops, and a family that mistook quiet for harmless. If this reminded you to trust that small, cold feeling in your gut, or to always keep the proof, the message, the dated page, take that as your sign, and do it today. And if someone you love is being made to feel like staff in their own family, send this to them. This has been her side of the story for every woman who held it together alone. If you want more stories like Claire's, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.